This is the Cult of Nick.
Alrighty then, and for our first guest on the Cult of Nick, we're going to be talking to Peter Robbins. Now let me explain, this guy is a hugely influential expert in the field of UFO extraterrestrial studies. He gets into some of the detail of some of the big cases and brings out some of the things that you may not have encountered before. You may have heard of him actually, Peter Robbins. He's been on the circuit, so to speak, for quite some time and has really, like I say, made a name for himself with a lot of different points of view on all of the big cases. We can't possibly get everything that we want out of his brain in one go, but we're going to give it a good go. Let's get him on. Peter, thanks for joining us.
It's good to be on your show, Nick, and good afternoon to you, good morning to me.
Do you know what? I'm looking at your CV, I'm looking at all of the stuff you've done, all the topics you've done. You've been involved in this, forever now, right? How long, when did you get involved in UFO studies? Give us a bit of your background.
Sure. I got involved about 40 years ago, and it happened very suddenly for me. As far as my background, I grew up in New York City and on Long Island in a lovely village about 40 miles east of Manhattan. Happy childhood, quite idyllic. My only dream as a kid was to be an artist. I was a gifted young artist. I was had special oil painting lessons, small fish, big fish in a small pond in my lower schooling, studied art in university, and then went to what I feel is still the best art school in America, the School of Visual Arts in New York. And a few years after graduating, joined the faculty as a painting instructor. I taught painting there for over a dozen years in their School of Continuing Education and worked very hard to make that dream come true. And by the time that the whole UFO thing kind of invaded my life, I really was living my dream. I had a small commercial loft, like many artists in New York, living there illegally and painting away every day, mine in East Chinatown, and was beginning to sell my paintings, show my work, and living, eating, and breathing the New York art scene. Also picking up shortly thereafter the beginning of what was to become the great punk music movement that through my sister Helen, who went on to become a gold and platinum record award winner for as a lyricist for the Blue Oyster Cult and other great groups, and ultimately to have a wonderful band that broke in right at the beginning there, and the legendary Club CBGB's. But one afternoon, something happened that changed my life. I was going through some drawings that I had done as a child, and it was at a time for me when it was February, and that's the Chinese New Year. And if you've ever been in a Chinese community at Chinese New Year, you're like living in a demilitarized zone for several days with nothing but fireworks going off and the smell of cordite 24 hours a day. And I hadn't slept much the previous few days. And looking at those childhood drawings, something triggered in me, and a profound memory that I had repressed. I guess it's silly to say if I have other repressed memories from childhood, I don't remember them. But this may well have been it. It was certainly the grandfather of them. And within a minute, I was reliving a profoundly clear daylight UFO sighting that I had had with my sister Helen when she was just 12 and I was 14 above our neighborhood. And I could hardly believe this was happening to me. I mean, how could you forget something so life-changing? But if there's enough impetus and enough reason, you will put it out of your mind. And in my case, at 14, I was an innocent, straight little nerdy kid. I wasn't into sports. I read a lot, loved history, collected rocks and stamps and coins and bugs. I was still a Boy Scout at 14, for God's sakes. And all of a sudden, we caught something moving in the sky and looked up to see 5 silvery white, disc-shaped objects that had come in. I had caught them out of my right peripheral vision at a high rate of speed and stopped over the neighbor's house across the street. And we looked and we looked and we looked. They were in a very precise V-type formation and close enough that we could see that each one was like a tipped dinner plate, like an oval, close enough to make out regular detailing around the edge of each that only read like windows would look on a commercial airliner, except again, they were round and absolutely no appendages. And in the decades that I've been doing investigative work, I'm sure in interviewing many hundreds of people, I've had more times than I can count when people have recounted to me a phenomena that I experienced that morning. I call it the checklist phenomena. And it's simply, you look up and you see something and your logical, rational mind rattles off everything that it's not. Planes, kites, blimps, helicopters, balloons, reflections from the ground, odd-shaped clouds, a bit of floating debris. And then you kind of hit the wall. I know I did. And I realized I was looking at something truly anomalous. Now, I guess depending on the person, that could be a moment of joy, excitement, fear. For me, it threw everything that I thought I knew as a youngster completely out the window. I grew up at a time when Saturday mornings, me and my little friends would go to the Fantasy Movie Theater in Rockville Center and see a double feature, often, one of the great B movies about aliens and flying saucers. And they were fun. But I guess somewhere along the line, I absorbed the adult attitude that, flying saucers are real, but in the movies. And this did not track with that. I knew that I was looking at something truly phenomenal. And I also understood that ridicule attached to the subject, and it was not something I was going to discuss with my friends. It's a longer story, but to cut to the chase, later that day, my sister asked me if I wanted to talk about it, and I said no. And again, more than 14 years later, this memory springs forth. I call Helen, asked her if it's a good time to talk, and had collected myself enough after being shaken to the core by this to know that if I told her what I remembered, Nick, she would either say yes or no. And I'd never know for sure in my heart whether or not she remembered the precise thing I did. So I set the scene where we were standing on the front lawn, about how far apart, the time of year, what the weather was like. And she stopped me mid-sentence and said, "Stop, I know what you're talking about." And she told me essentially what I just told you. And she said, "But there's more," and went on to describe what now is something I've heard hundreds of times, even from a number of people word for word over the years, especially during the many years I worked as the assistant to the highly respected and much beloved and well-known investigative writer Bud Hopkins, the real father of scientific abduction studies. And what she was describing was nothing less than being lifted off the ground and taken, literally flying through the air and taken into one of these things. And I had no working reference point toward what this was about. I never read anything on UFOs or abduction. Lord knows there wasn't much out there in the 1960s. And she described being walked through a metal hallway by, in her words, coming from her 12-year-old memory, little doctors with big heads and big black eyes that talked to her in her head, and one very tall one. And the next thing she knew, she was on a table with telepathic words coming into her head. And my reaction as she was veering into this part of the conversation, maybe not unlike some of your listeners in the same situation, was, "My God, my sister's gone crazy." And I caught myself a moment later and said, 6 seconds ago, it was all right to have 5 disc-shaped flying objects hanging over the Parker's house across the street, but now your sister's crazy. And my sister and I were very close throughout her life. She passed in 2000. She was a good kid. She wasn't a liar, and there'd be no reason to, embellish such a story. And I became obsessed with the subject then and there. So much so that even though I continued to teach painting, paint, show my work for the next number of years, the real thrill had gone out of it because something more important had superimposed itself on that dream. And you know what? I resented the hell out of it. I still do to a degree. One can be philosophical and say it was predestined or this is what you were meant to do or whatever. Well, I don't know about that, but I do know that the work was important enough that I simply stuck with it. And I hope I've added some valuable contributions to it. And here I am all these years later, continuing to do so.
Peter, I think this is absolutely fascinating. And this is obviously a story that you will have told a number of times, but we've got to explore it because the novelty for me has not worn off because I'm just being told it for the first time here. The vast majority of people I know who claim to have had contact from extraterrestrials are similar to you in that they describe it in the same way, invaded my life and not perhaps something that they're overly delighted about. Repressed memory is quite a controversial area. Obviously, it must have occurred to you that, then again, you've got it backed up by your sister, but do you think that perhaps some of it has been suggested and maybe didn't happen, or what's your take on that?
Well, the fact that unprompted by any specifics, Helen confirmed my precise memory of that event. And just to jump back for one moment, you were kind enough to introduce me as an expert. Even after all these years, the main thing I've learned is how little I know. And I'm wary of people that refer to themselves as experts because you're an expert at the unknown, which is kind of an oxymoron. I'm not even sure what we're dealing with here are extraterrestrial in nature, although I think, ironically, that's probably the most conservative explanation for at least some of these phenomena, which I tend to lean toward, but am open to other possibilities. But, sure. It's funny how in investigative work, you do research and it leads you into different paths. I certainly began to read articles in different psychology magazines about repressed memory. I'm very proud to say that for the years that I worked with Larry Warren, 9 years working on our book, Left at Eastgate, about the Rendlesham Forest incident, that although it's an institution in the UK and many of what we used to call Commonwealth countries, the Samaritans International, one of the most extraordinarily fine volunteer organizations in the world. It's very modest in its setup in the United States, but I was a Samaritan for 8 years. And you can bet that I used that opportunity in part where it was appropriate to discuss with mental health professionals repressed memory syndrome and the like. I will say that I became so curious about what really lay behind it for me that several years into the work, I availed myself of 3 invitations, one from Bud Hopkins, one from another one of my mentors who died much too young, but was a highly decorated New York City police detective, Sergeant Pete Mazzola, who was specially trained in regressive hypnosis for criminal investigation, and one other hypnotist to bring me back to that day and that morning with my sister to glean if there was any more. And I waited until I was fully ready. And each person that I worked with said I was a good subject and that I went into alpha state very deeply, and people experience hypnosis in different ways. I observed as a witness more hypnotic regressions than I can even remember now over the decades with Bud Hopkins, who is a superb practitioner. And what I remembered. And you know, we could
do
get
you remember
into...
going on board a UFO? Do you remember going in the metal?
No.
What do you remember? You just remember seeing the things, yeah?
No. My sister, that was her experience. I was literally, I went unconscious. I passed out for the first time in my life. And this is not uncommon in that area of specific study where siblings or partners or husbands and wives or friends, one person is taken, one person is not. Helen was always very outspoken about this in her private and professional life for the rest of her life, and said at best, reflecting back on that experience always made her feel special. But she was not pleased about being taken, and was not some, new age goofball. She was very analytical, although her professional self was an in-your-face, punk performer and a very gifted musician and singer-songwriter. She had a degree in English literature. She was a graduate of the French Fashion Institute in New York, extremely well-studied, a brilliant amateur herpetologist, that is, specialist in reptiles. She was quite a Renaissance woman in many ways, but she was fearless about being an advocate for experiencers and was literally up until, a few days before she passed.
So your memories of that day, would you say that you can rely on them? Do you see what I mean? You're comfortable that they've not been implanted? Because the controversy for people that are not aware with repressed memory is that in fact these memories have been implanted by either a process of hypnosis or maybe a process of therapy where things are implied and stories get built upon. And do you think there's any of that that's occurred to you, or are you absolutely sure that what happened on the day is you saw these 5 silvery objects and so on?
Well, let's start by the understanding that, of course, for some people in certain circumstances, based on their history or what have you, of course, memories can be implanted. But let's remember here that I was a 14-year-old innocent kid growing up in middle-class America who never went to a therapist, was living a kind of simple childlike life up until that moment. There was nothing I could ever imagine that would have interfered. My sister even more so. She was 12 years old. Nobody that, for me, that's wilder than, as wild a conspiracy theory as you can imagine, that somebody hijacked us and put memories in our head when we were little children and, made us believe it for some arcane, Machiavellian reason. No, I'm very comfortable that that memory that we shared, and again, very important to say, independently confirm to each other rather than one person remembering, telling the other person and the other person saying yes, is as real as any of the unrepressed memories that I have from childhood.
So I have you down kind of as a researcher because I've been reading some of these articles you've written and the research you've been doing. But I wonder, is that the only direct experience that you've had, or was it ongoing? Did anything else happen later in your life?
Good question. Over the years and decades, I have met people, and I'm sure you're aware of them, probably have even interviewed some, who have extraordinary, paranormal, anomalous experiences threading their ways through their entire lives. For me, this was the experience, so to say. However, I had a multiple UFO sighting in February of 1988 in Suffolk, when Larry Warren and I went there for what I had thought would be our only trip to England to research our book. Again, I thought it would take a year or two to write. Boy, was I wrong about everything. And it happened not 5 miles, 6 miles away from the sites of the very famous Rendlesham Forest incident. It was a shattering night for me. And at the time, as a budding investigative writer, I traveled with notebooks and pens, of course, but with a microcassette recorder in each pocket with new batteries and a tape. And when we began to have this sighting over the forest, I pulled out our recorders, gave Larry one, and we recorded what we were seeing as we were seeing it. That transcript of those tapes is included in Left at East Gate. I should also say that independently, about 10 years apart, parts of those tapes were put through voice stress analysis technology, which is geared to detect lies, stress, fabrications in either live conversation or a first-generation recording. And both times came up extremely authentic and not questioned.
Okay, so you actually... let's get into Rendlesham Forest here, actually. For anyone who doesn't know, we've discussed it actually last week. It's a big aspect of the UFO subculture. Probably it's the UK's version, really, of the famous crash, the Roswell crash, isn't it, in America? It's our kind of Roswell, really. Do you want to context it and tell us a little bit about what happened there and what that's about?
Sure. You're right in your comparison to Roswell, but only in terms of its high visibility and best known aspect. Roswell, where I'll be next month, actually, for the first time in several years, and for the first time going out to the actual crash site, which I've looked forward to doing for many years, is the seminal kick it into gear, moment in the early days of the post-war UFO phenomena. The so-called Rendlesham Forest incident, which is actually a series of completely separate events that occurred on 3 consecutive nights between Christmas and New Year's of 1980 in Suffolk, East Anglia, in the proximity of the Rendlesham Forest, and 2 highly secured NATO bases there, RAF Bentwaters, where literally all of the American Air Force witnesses who were involved as witnesses were stationed, and the sister base, RAF Woodbridge, about 5 miles away, which is still an active RAF base. Bentwaters was decommissioned about 20-odd years ago. I guess many of your listeners are familiar with it, and it's confusing to many people in that in educating yourself to it, it takes a while to sort it out because of the different accounts of different witnesses on different nights of different phenomena and different experiences. Probably the last years, the ones with the highest visibility due to the media's coverage of them and a new book that came out last year on the events are former United States Air Force personnel John Burroughs and Jim Peniston, who were involved on the first night. My co-author, Larry Warren, who was a United States Air Force security police officer. Jim and John were law enforcement cops. And to take a moment to make the distinction, I don't know how it is in the British military, probably much the same, but in the American Air Force, there are law enforcement police officers who are the equivalent of your bobbies in civilian life, where the security cops are paramilitary. They are literally the trained killers, trained to repel invaders from bases, etc. And Larry was involved on the third night of events to sort of high point some of the events that constitute the incident. On the first night, unknowns came in over the weapons storage area, and that's a euphemism for nuclear weapons storage area at RAF Bentwaters, and shone beams of light down to the hardened bunkers where nuclear ordnance was kept, and I should say in full violation of our treaty, the United States treaty with the United Kingdom at the time.
Now, can I hang on? Can I just dive in here? When you say unknowns,
absolutely. When
you say unknowns, do you mean what? Flying saucers, aircraft, or people? Or what does that mean? Unknowns.
Well, it means in the same way that we say a UFO. It's an unidentified flying object. One can ascribe, purpose, meaning, origin to them, if you want, but the key word there is unknown.
Yeah.
craft of an undetermined origin came in over the WSA. And normally, I mean, those things would be shot out of the air. If they were fired upon, there were no hits. And being a particularly moisture filled night, you had the beams of light were actually visible as lines of light going right down to the ground, because the light, I guess the equivalent of what we'd now call something like an industrial laser, or at least that was the appearance, caught on billions of, little droplets of moisture in the air. Some years after we began researching in the early 1990s, the former deputy base commander, who was a lieutenant colonel at that time, agreed to meet with Larry and I face to face at a prearranged destination across the street from the Pentagon, in the food court of a mall, of all places. And we had a very compelling hour and 20-minute conversation with him, which was recorded with all parties permitting. And the transcript, like many transcripts, is reproduced and left at Eastgate, fully authentic. And he told us at that time that although he didn't see it, and although he had no way of verifying it per se, those beams of light somehow penetrated the hardened bunkers and, in his unforgettable term, adversely affected the ordnance. Now, I know that may sound absolutely science fiction-y to some of your listeners, but we now have an extraordinary amount of documented information in terms of declassified military documents from the American archives, as well as literally unassailable testimony from honorably retired officers and military personnel that give a history of UFO and nuclear events. One of the best known ones was it occurred in 1967 in the United States base over the Malmstrom Air Force Base, where a then young Lieutenant Robert Salas was at the screens observing UFOs over the base, which he could hear the chatter of men seeing them. They were picked up on radar, shutting down one nuclear missile after another that were in his charge. I digress here, but that was part of the first night.
So let me just check that I get that straight.
Sure.
The first incident, you have a nuclear facility at Rendlesham Forest, an unknown, a flying saucer, whatever it was, some sort of vehicle, we assume, flies over there.
Yes.
Shines light down on it, and the light actually goes through the walls, according to one of the witnesses, which is insane. And what, then it chips off, and they don't know, they're none the wiser, right?
That's exactly so. And for anyone that questions this, and you have every reason to do so, I would refer you, for starters, to two important books on the subject. Robert Salas's Faded Giant, written with a co-author, Jamie Klotz, I believe, and the very scholarly UFOs and Nukes by the American investigative writer Robert Hastings, which is completely about this phenomena. And of course I know how this sounds, and of course I know how such admonitions, such claims, such accounts will inevitably be used by some to target the credibility of people like me and some of my colleagues. I accept that. It comes with the territory. All I can say is, if you question it, study it and make your own best decision. But yes, that is exactly the best account that I can give of that part of the first night. Better known is that then Airman John Burroughs, who was standing guard at the east gate of the Bentwaters sister base, RAF Woodbridge, on that same night observed a light going down into the woods. It did not suggest a crash in that there was no explosion, no ground concussion, no fire. But this is at a very tense moment in the Cold War. This is a highly militarized zone. And of course, he radioed in the report. And shortly thereafter, he and Sergeant Jim Peniston, also law enforcement, were driven into the area by a third personnel, and his name escapes me at the moment. I'll think of it. And the vehicle drove them as far into the woods, into the area as it could go, and they made their way, the two of them, on foot the rest of the way. Ever so many television documentaries and television shows have done their own treatments of what Jim and John alleged that they experienced and saw. And it was nothing less than a particular machine of undetermined origin that Jim says that at a certain point he walked up to, observed writing hieroglyphic symbols of some sort that he copied into his field notebook. And when he touched one of the symbols, he alleges that a long binary code of ones and zeros downloaded itself into his head. And then it was a message from time travelers from the future for him to reveal at another time, which I have a great deal of problems with. John has no memory of it, and also is very clear that the first time Jim even mentioned it to him was almost 30 years later, in October of 2010. Be that as it may, a very real event happened, and it left physical traces, which were documented the next day when the men brought back other personnel to the area. On the second night, UFOs were observed in the sky over the forest and the base area. For me, the most profound and least known event among non-specialists that night was that the only female Air Force personnel that we know of who was directly involved, Sergeant Bonnie Tamplin, was sitting in the cab of a military truck. Very temperate night, I have to stress here, because window was down, and an orb or orbs of light flew into the truck cab, and it traumatized her to such a degree that she was removed from active service. On the third night, the two major events were the deputy base commander, who up until that night had heard about this, but was very skeptical, as people are wont to be about when you mention the term UFOs, and an adjutant or an assistant told him that they were back, and he put together a team of, I believe, 6 men, possibly 7, all of who we know who they are, and they went into the woods themselves with night scopes and other appropriate material to verify, as well as Colonel Charles Halt's own personal microcassette recorder. And it was during that event that they observed yet another UFO-type phenomena coming in directly over them. It's been described by them as like a blinking eye. And it shone a beam of light right down to within a few feet of where they were standing.
Don't start. I think it's something other than the ground. I think it's something that's... There is no doubt about it. There's some type of strange flashing red light ahead. There's yellow. I saw a yellow tinge in it, too. Weird. It appears that you may be moving a little bit this way. It's brighter than it has been. Yellow. It's coming this way. It is definitely coming this way. Pieces of it are shooting off. There is no doubt about it. This is weird. Keep the flashlights off. There's something very, very strange. This is unreal.
Meanwhile, out in a farmer's field, I don't know, maybe 500 yards from them, I'm not sure of the exact distance, Larry Warren and the men he was with, who had been taken off of guard duty that night to be involved in another assignment, were brought out to the area by military transport, disarmed, broken into 3-person groups, and told to head that way into the forest and, quote unquote, investigate a disturbance. They came through the forest, through a extraordinarily powerful electromagnetic field in that the static electricity, raised the hair, to put it mildly. The same thing that Jim and John, I should say, encountered on the first night. And in that field was a phenomena that was a self-contained oval whitish ground fog that was self-illuminated. It was, Larry describes it as yellowish, or it literally glowed. And there was no ambient light. There was no moon. They were more than a mile at that point from RAF Woodbridge. There was one farmer's house out in the field, still there, and the lights were on the second floor. And it was deduced that people in the house were observing what they were observing. This, again, is now well after midnight. At a certain point, men, by the way, were ordered to surround the ground fog. And at a certain point, they observed a reddish light slowly coming in from the direction of the North Sea. And it came down not only over the field, but over where they were standing. And eyes were on it as it exploded without a sound with such magnesium brightness that Larry, and I'm sure anybody else looking at it, suffered temporary blindness. And when their eyes adjusted, there in that ground fog was a fully structured craft, and things went on from there. These are the main events that mark the so-called Rendlesham Forest UFO incident.
And which of those main events is the one that fascinates you the most, Peter? Because I don't even know where to begin with all of this. Yes. It's such a feast, isn't it, of things?
Yes. Yeah, that's well said. The one that I am certainly most personally involved with, because it was the event that my co-author, who when we began working, I was convinced was an authentic military witness. I had never met anybody angrier or more obsessed with anything. And in his case, something that had happened to him when he was 19 years old in the Air Force. And I have stood by his side for 28 years now, but he was already years into being an outspoken witness on this subject. In fact, he was the whistleblower. It was his testimony and no one else's that caused the Freedom of Information Act action, which resulted in the release of the one-page memorandum written by then Lieutenant Colonel Hall 2 weeks after the fact, which, even though it minimizes, redacts the events of those nights, he says it was 2 in that report rather than 3, there it is on Air Force letterhead signed by that officer, Deputy Base Commander. And for many years, that was the only authentic confirmed document we had from military circles confirming it. But yes, Larry's event fascinates me the most in that it has the most actual physical court-worthy evidence attached to it. Obviously, profoundly important is the nuclear incident that occurred on the first night. And I'm very proud to say that that was the event that caught the attention of a then Member of Parliament, former Admiral of the Fleet, former Chief of Staff of the MOD, Admiral Lord Peter Hill Norton, who became one of our greatest champions. And up until he died 15 years ago at the age of 92, as I recall, was probably the greatest royal thorn in the side of officialdom in the United Kingdom, demanding explanations and convinced that there was nuclear ordnance on base, and we have other confirmations of that now. However, Jim and John still very much sticking to their national security oath, and I can only respect them for it, will not comment on it, nor will the well-known Nick Pope, formerly the ministry, who co-wrote the newest book on Rendlesham with them that came out last spring, entitled Encounter in the Rendlesham Forest.
Now, Nick Pope, for people who don't know, he's nowadays, I guess, a UFO researcher, but he used to work for the Ministry of Defence on the UFO desk. Interviewed him a number of times. And his story runs something like this. He wasn't, quote unquote, a believer. He didn't think there was anything in it. This incident that we're discussing, Rendlesham Forest, which, like you say, he wrote a book about, it's at this point that he changed his mind and thought there might be something in it. This is the thing. Something happened here, Peter. There's no getting around that, is there?
Well, there's no question that not only something happened in those woods in December of 1980, but some things, plural. Again, in Larry's case, the physical evidence and the circumstantial evidence is the kind of material that if such incidents were adjudicated in our courts of law, this could be the case that would certainly win it. To be blunt, people have probably been convicted of murder on less evidence than revolves around Larry's particular involvement on the third night. And let me be specific here, Nick. We actually have Larry's medical examination form from a February 1981 examination at Lincoln Heath Medical Clinic, a nearby base clinic, to document the fact that he suffered optical retinal burn exposure. The retinas of his eyes were burned when that bright light appeared preceding the craft's appearance on the ground. Had the retinas of his eyes been burned previously to his joining the United States Air Force, it most certainly would have been picked up in his Air Force physical. The absolutely site-specific location in the farmer's field called Capel Green, where that craft sat and where he was always insistent that event took place this months before we ever went there. And I'm talking about starting from the time that we began to engage in this project together in the summer of 1987. The first edition of Left at East Gate was in fact published the summer of 1997, not ironically on the 50th anniversary of the so-called modern UFO phenomena, Roswell, etc. But it was republished in 2005 in an expanded edition that marked on maps in drawings that he made for me, and the site that he pointed out on that very first walk out to the field in February of '88, as the forest broke away and as his arm shot out, and I'm audio recording all this, and he said it sat right there. And if you listen to the tape, there's several moments of silence, and it's followed up by him saying, but of course, that's a coincidence that that area that I'm pointing to where it sat, and that would have been 8 years and 2 months before, is different color than the rest of the field. And my first thought was not, oh my God, a trace of a UFO that landed 8 years and 2 months ago. I mean, please. It was, yeah, that's got to be a coincidence. It could be a play of light. It could be a lightning strike. It could be a location where the owners dumped nitrate fertilizer and didn't grade it out. But as we roamed that field for the next few hours, I kept, and Larry too, kept coming back to that area because it was indeed different. The color of the soil was different. The feel of the soil was different. We drew samples from that exact area, and then I drew samples, control samples from 100, 200, 300 feet out into the field. And a very simple experiment followed that afternoon at the bed and breakfast we were staying at, where equal amounts of soil from a control area and from what certainly proved to be the affected area were mixed with the exact same amounts of water. The control sample became mud with a couple of stirs of a tablespoon. The affected sample, I couldn't get to reconstitute. Literally, the dirt sank to the bottom in clumps or floated on the top as dust. I returned to that field a year and a half later in the summer and was shocked. This is now 9.5 years after the event to see the exact same area was now bright green in a field that had already gone to hay and was yellow. The photographs are very dramatic of that. I went back the next year, this time after consulting a research laboratory in America that I had contracted to do an analysis of the soil I collected with, I believe it was 3 2-quart heavy plastic containers, and drew samples according to the chemist's instructions that I was working with, brought them back through customs and JFK, which is a whole nother story. Those analysis, and nobody has ever contested them, established the following. And I should also say right here, just for the record, that the chemist that did that soil analysis is a real person. He is alive and well. He became a good friend. His name is Matthew Moniz. He now continues his work as a chemist for another laboratory in Massachusetts, his home state. And he established, among other things, that number one, the soil was a different color, which he said is not uncommon in a farmer's field. However, under a scanning electron microscope, it was structurally different, that in laboratory conditions, he was unable to easily get the soil to reconstitute with water. It literally shed water like a duck's feathers, that they did seed germination tests. And in these tests, using control samples, grew seeds from what indigenous crops that would have been grown, wheat, rye, whatever, and other plants, and they grew fine. In the affected soil, they took much longer to grow, and his term, only mutant strains emerged from that soil. In certain soils around the world, there are tiny, maybe sand-sized grains of metallic particles. It's just the way it is. In the control samples, it was just what one would expect. In the affected sample, it was +4 the amount of tiny macroscopic metallic particles. When I asked him what he could deduce from that, he said there was only one thing, that something had sat on that spot and exerted such a powerful electromagnetic effect. And imagine that you are a little metallic particle no bigger than a piece of sand, and you are being pulled through farm soil and working your way through it because there is a force that powerful above pulling it. For me, certainly the most dramatic results that they got from the test, remembering that this area of Suffolk is very close to the water, as you know, any Brit knows, and any American that knows geography, which is bloody few of us, unfortunately, 5-6 miles away. There is a component of sand in the soil, and one would expect same. And in the control samples, it was absolutely normal. In the affected sample, Nick, there was no sand. It had been melted. It had been reduced to an interim form of glass. Add to this the fact that in, I believe it was 1984, 1985, Larry was married to his first wife, who was a physical therapist associated with a hospital in the state of Connecticut. And one day she observed that he was bleeding through the skin. No lesion, no cut. He was bleeding through the skin. They went to the emergency room. He was examined. Ultimately, the doctors that did it asked him if he had ever been exposed to an unshielded radiation source. He could only respond, I may have. They said, what do you mean? He said, I'm not at liberty to say. Those hospital documents are also included in a separate appendix left at East Gate. These are some of the physical evidence. And for me, just a reminder that when you do investigative research, time is not really a factor, and things can come up years after the fact that impact on your knowledge of the case. In this case, last August, Larry had posted a number of snapshots that he had taken when he was in the service in England in 1980-81. And it was something that he did every once in a while. And, you know, we'd look at him and talk about him. I was familiar with many of them, but not some others. And on the morning of the third night, the event that he was going to be involved in, he had returned from being on leave for 2 days previous. He was not aware of the events. And that morning, and we know the exact morning, it was December 28th, 1980, he went to the base store, the PX, and he bought an Instamatic 110 film camera. And that first day, he ran a roll of film through it, and he posted one of those images online. It was a very innocuous snapshot. It was a photograph of an A-10 tank buster aircraft landing in the distance, and not the most exciting photo in the world. And a friend of ours, Mick Sayer, in fact, who lives in England, observed what he thought was a pair of dots on the photo, on the snapshot above the aircraft. They were very small. They could have been dust on the film, or an imperfection in the developing, or dirt on the negative, or, you know, dirt on the snapshot. The snapshot was, you know, a little photograph that was 33 years old at least. And another one of our Facebook friends who was certainly knowledgeable about optics enlarged it. The top dot was very fuzzy and we couldn't make it out. However, I had one of the shocks of my investigative life when I took a look at the blowup of the one directly above the A-10. It was precisely the shape of the craft that he observed in the field 12 hours later. We asked Dr. Bruce Maccabee, probably the best known and most respected photo analyst in the annals of UFO research history, who had served as a consultant to the United States Navy for over 30 years to look at it. He couldn't find anything bogus about it. And we are stuck with that. Again, what I'm talking about is what we call triangulation of evidence, Nick. It's something that my dear departed police detective friend drummed into me as the way to proceed in UFO research. Look, I'm a very pragmatic guy. I don't get channeled messages from Martians. I don't have secret sources in the Pentagon. I'm a plodding, investigative research writer. And when you have those varieties and kinds of evidence that corroborate each other, and I'll even add to that moment where Larry and I came through those woods on our first walk out to Capel Green, the site of his event from 8 years and 2 months before, in February of 1988, and his arm shot out. It was an involuntary reflex, and his voice was right there. That tape has also been voice stress analyzed. There's no deception. There's no intent to deceive. It's simply a person reacting to a very real situation as they best remembered it.
I follow what you're saying with the triangulation thing. I often think of it as being like a little game of algebra. We have some bits of information, we don't have other bits. And I guess one of the things that we could say is we know that something happened here. And one of the other things that we can say is we can judge roughly how different groups of people are reacting to it. So the UFO community, well, they love this one because we all know something happened here. Everyone agrees on that. And then I guess what we can do is look at how the British government specifically responded to this. And maybe you can give us a little bit of comment. I mean, how are you doing for time? You all right for another 20 minutes?
Oh, sure, of course.
Great. Okay. So if we just look at the reaction of, for want of a better word, the establishment to this, we have some people who want the information to come out. They know something happened. They want to communicate about it. And then on the other hand, you have a chance here to understand what our government's relationship is to this to this something that we're discussing, extraterrestrials. What does it tell us, the way in which the British government have reacted? Do you think they have a relationship with this? Do you think they were finding out about it? What do you think was going on?
Well, I think it's a great question. The fact is, once Roswell happened, and let's take us back here to the summer of 1947, the war had ended 2 years before, World War II. It was a golden moment for the American government. We had helped save democracy. We had certainly in our own minds come in and assisted our European friends in fighting back the tyranny of Nazism. And through the Marshall Plan, we were helping in an extraordinarily noble way our former enemies, the Germans and the Japanese, to rebuild their countries and, I guess, by implication, their philosophies. And Lord knows the Japanese and the Germans have been extremely pacifist governments ever since. But that summer, specifically July, if you ask literally any distinguished historian of post-war American history, that is the month that the great majority of them agree that the so-called Cold War began in earnest. If one were to go to the archives of a distinguished American publication called Foreign Affairs, a monthly dealing with just that subject with some of the most important names in American political and military thinking, publishing in it over the decades, the July issue contained an article from a then unknown political scientist, a young guy out of graduate school named George Kennan. It was titled on containment, and he used the pseudonym of X. I should say here that Kennan went on to become the advisor to, I believe, a record-breaking 9 American presidents. He lived until he was 101 or 102. And in that article, he described a idea to contain the Soviets within the borders that had been reset at the end of World War II, which was then referred to as the Iron Curtain. And if we could contain them, we, the West, we could avoid a shooting or a hot war and have the term that emerged, of course, was a Cold War. Now, isn't it interesting that the month that the UFO phenomena explodes in modern times is the same month that the so-called Cold War goes into effect? Now, I'm not saying this to suggest, there's some mystical connection between them. The fact is that they were overlaid on each other and born together. And over the next 45 years, Her Majesty's government, the United States government, other first world governments played the Cold War against the UFO phenomena and vice versa, if one could take the attention off the other. There is every reason to feel that there was rational concern that had a legitimate, truly anomalous, unidentified flying object coming and going with impunity from wherever, under whatever control, were misinterpreted as an enemy plane, or sooner along in time, an enemy missile. It could set off a conflagration, a nuclear conflagration, could set off World War III. And so there was ample reason for the American government and the British government to classify the matter of UFOs as well above top secret and make it the preeminent secret that still threads its way through. As far as what's being covered up here, and there certainly is a cover-up, I think it's naive to assume not. Part of it may be, the hubris of how little the so-called people in power actually know about this phenomena after more than 6 decades, or events that they feel or facts relative to it that might cause panic. In America, in October of 1938, the great Orson Welles, who was then head of a radio theater that had a wonderful program on it, adapted the great H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and many folks in your country are familiar with this as well. The program was so effective on a naive America on the edge of the beginning. We were in the first month or so of World War II in Europe, that it caused true panic in many respects throughout a certain part of the population in the United States. And damned if that event on radio was not used to refer back to the potential for mass panic of, beings from another planet coming here and blah, blah, blah. Again, when I first corresponded with Nick Pope, who then, and this is 1992, was not only with the ministry, and he served with them with distinction, I believe, for more than 20 years, but for 2 of those years, and his whole UFO persona is built on this, he was the official person charged with the investigation and looking into the UFO phenomena for Her Majesty's government. In our many discussions, he continues to maintain that he was the person. I feel, with respect to Nick, that there were other people, probably more highly briefed than he, involved in the same work. But I still have the form letter that he sent me in 1992, which said, among other things, that the events of December 1980, whatever they were deemed by the Ministry of Defense to be of no defense significance. Now, that is an absolute quote that has come back to bite the ministry in the behind repeatedly over the decades, because, to paraphrase Lord Hill Norton, if, UFOs were coming in with impunity over a nuclear base in the United Kingdom, how dare anyone suggest that it was of no defense significance?
I'm piecing this together as you're talking here. I'm just putting down some notes, and the picture that I'm building up runs something like this. Orson Welles does his play, causes panic when he does a play of The War of the Worlds. And I've heard that audio. I can kind of see how that happened. He played it realistically.
It's a wonderful radio play, very effective.
It is very good.
We are bringing you an eyewitness account of what's happening on the Wilmuth Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey. We now return you to Carl Phillips at Grover's Mill.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I on? Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmuth's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Ah, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object, while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I can see it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. If those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. A humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Oh, Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles, spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill. Evidently, there's some difficulty with our field transmission. However, we will return to that point at the earliest opportunity. In the meantime, we have a late bulletin from San Diego, California. Professor Indelkoffer, speaking at a dinner of the California Astronomical Society, expressed the opinion that the explosions on Mars are undoubtedly nothing more than severe volcanic disturbances on the surface of the planet. We continue now with our piano interlude.
So that causes huge panic. Everyone's kind of familiar with that, Orson Welles in America. Then we go to Roswell. Roswell happens. And if we assume that that's real, that some sort of, flying saucer crashed there, and at that point the American government have to adjust to a new reality, perhaps, that they were unaware of, perhaps, the extraterrestrials exist. This would be 1947. And then the fear is, well, we'll have a repeat of Orson Welles if we tell people. So we're going to have to start to keep this one secret.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection. Joe Wilson reports to us now from Chicago. The Army may be getting to the bottom of all this talk about the so-called flying saucer. As a matter of fact, the 509th Atomic Bomb Group headquarters at Roswell, New Mexico, reports that it has received one of the discs which landed on a ranch outside Roswell. Other Army officials say that further information indicates that the object had a diameter of about 20 to 25 feet and that nothing in the apparent construction indicated any capacity for speed and that there was no evidence of a power plant. The disc also appeared too flimsy to carry a man. Now, back to Taylor Grant in New York.
Because it was reported initially, wasn't it? A flying saucer has crash-landed. It was in the papers, wasn't it? And then the second or third day, they started to take control of the story, I think, if memory serves.
Oh, yes.
So there's initially kind of an honest reaction from all of these figures, and then we get to where we are with Rendlesham Forest. What I'm wondering is, do you think that this is the point at which the British government are brought into the secret and the Americans say, yeah, that was Marty the Martian there and his mates with us and we know who he is? Or do you think it's more that they haven't got a clue what's going on? Maybe they've been told by our allies, America, there's something happening. Do you know what I mean? Where do you think it stands? Because some people think there's direct cooperation going on here.
Yeah, well, I think that is purely speculative. And I think many people growing up in an era where conspiracy theories are taken seriously by millions of people around the world, some of them very sensible ones, some of them wild as hell, they superimpose their belief, their fears, their longings, what have you, on information and present it as though it's authentic. I'm very careful to parse what I absolutely know and could prove in a court of law to what I am convinced of but can't prove, to what I think, to what I believe, to what I fear, etc. Now, in this case, you've only to study certainly one of the most important UFO books ever written. That is Timothy Good's seminal Above Top Secret, or his profoundly important follow-up volume, Beyond Top Secret, which is an assault of official documentation, much of it originating with Her Majesty's government, to document the fact that the British government has been very aware of this phenomena going back right to the 1940s, no question about it. Their concerns about it parallel those of the Americans. And I'm not just talking about, Tim's belief. He's a brilliant researcher, as fine a writer on the subject and as connected as any civilian has ever been. I have tremendous respect for Tim, think the world of him. And you can see reproductions of documents. Also, much to the credit of Her Majesty's government, some years ago, they began to declassify UFO-related documentation, formerly classified, much of it, and post it on a special part of a ministry website. I would classify all the documents as mid or lower level. Some of them are almost boring. Other ones are fascinating. There's some smoke, but no smoking gun. And I just think it's a shame that, I guess it was 2 years ago, they simply ended the project. It would have been, I think, very valuable to all of us had they continued. But at the time, I think they had posted over 10,000 separate documents. Whether or not this was done to assuage folks like us, or as a public relations gimmick, or a genuine attempt to help us prepare or to educate us, we can only speculate. But oh no, the Her Majesty's government awareness of this subject and its implications did not begin in December of 1980. Make no mistake about it.
I see. So when that's occurring, I wonder what sort of relationship it is that they have to this truth, if you see what I mean. Because one argument goes that in 1947, when the Roswell saucer crash landed, that's why we went to Cold War footing, because suddenly we're thinking to ourselves, if we're fighting amongst each other, it's going to be a problem when these bad boys start landing their flying saucers and taking over the planet, right? In other words, we need to unite the world with some sort of global government to anticipate the alien, the alien threat, I suppose. Do you think?
Well, that's a matter of belief. I know that, we could argue forever about predestination and that things are meant to be, or that actual coincidences sometimes happen. For me, the fact that the Roswell crash, and let me digress here for a moment and go back to the UFO nuclear issue. The Americans, for good and bad, for that it has bounced through history, cracked the code of nuclear power and created these horrific weapons, two of which were actually used to end the war in the Pacific. In July of 1947, there was only one single nuclear strike force in the entire world. It was the 509th Bomber Group, stationed at a small Army airfield just outside of a sleepy New Mexican town named Roswell. The reason that the unknowns may have been in that area, and I think here's a case where deductive reasoning and just using your common sense and making an educated guess suggests to me that the reason it happened there, as opposed to any other place in the world, was because of that fact. Again, the same month that the Cold War officially kicks in, and the same month that the UFO phenomena begins in earnest and explodes in newspapers around the world and becomes part of the lexicon, the public imagination, and the reality of the world we live in.
So they have a fascination with nuclear weapons from the sound of it, because they were hovering over nuclear facilities, weren't they? So that's one thing we can
and there is a tremendous history in terms of statistical fact that higher incidence of confirmed UFO sightings to start with, and I mean, when I say UFO sightings, in the modern world, I'm convinced that a great number, if not the great majority, of so-called UFO sightings are us. We have aircraft that is so advanced that it would seem like it comes from, parts unknown. That is the way it is under the Black Project program that has run for decades to develop advanced technology, which we, the people in the UK and the US, are not deemed worthy of knowing about. And the interest in nuclear use of nuclear energy being used by these human beings, I mean, for me, it's said best in a declassified document. It's actually the first official full report on the UFO phenomena that we know of that has been officially declassified many years ago. It came out officially in February of 1948. A kind of scrubbed down version was given to the media. The actual report is called Project Sign. You can Google it and read it. It's about 40 pages. Military terminology sometimes is just so in your face or hyper-patriotic or sometimes symbolic of the event. I love the fact that the declassified version of the paper was called Project Grudge. All right, we'll give it to you, but not much. There are points where you read through this document, and if you're somebody like me that's read through countless numbers of these documents, you have an understanding that official documents, or anybody that's ever worked in a government or military bureaucracy knows, they can be pretty boring and dry. Other times, a real human voice, an extraordinary thinking explodes through it. And at a certain point toward the end of this document, the individual who is writing it is speculating, and this is in 1940, probably late 1947 when it was written, early 1948 at the latest, that if beings from other planets were looking down on us or not aware of us, that no question about it, they would have been aware of us beginning in the summer of 1945. Why? Because that was when we set off our first nuclear detonations, which would have registered and could have been read or interpreted from well away from our planet. And that above all else, we should expect visitations from such civilizations now. Why? Because in light of man's violent history, and I'm paraphrasing here, and the fact that probably 100 years from then, we will be out in the star systems with even bigger and more effective weapons, and our same violent psychology. Above all else, we should be having an eye kept on us by now. And I do feel that that may well be one of the key points to remember here.
So the interesting thing, I guess, about these, the ins and outs of this is that as we're having this conversation, I'm imagining quite matter-of-fact, machine-powered flying saucers flying around, interested in our military and what's happening. Yet when we look at a lot of the testimony that we were going through before, you were talking about kind of glowing balls of fog, and then a lot of the testimony, well, I don't know, it doesn't quite tally with that, does it? It's not really kind of your petrol-powered flying saucers, apart from the incident with the hieroglyphs and stuff. A lot of it seems a little bit more miasmic than that, and it reminds me. Do you know what I mean? It reminds me of a researcher called Wilhelm Reich, who used to, I think, believe in cloud-based UFOs and stuff like that. He seemed to be more on this page than perhaps the modern lexicon of Independence Day, where, you know, they look like sort of frogs and they live inside metal flying saucers that, like I say, you imagine would be fueled by petrol. Do you want to comment on this guy, Wilhelm Reich, and bring him into this stuff?
Well, I will, but I'd almost rather save it for another show. It's almost... You've given me a ridiculous challenge to comment on a subject that I've followed very deeply since I was a teenager and am fairly knowledgeable about. Number one, I think you're inaccurate in postulating that Dr. Reich believed in like cloud-based UFOs or something. And I know, you know, I think it's a bit of a send up to think that advanced craft, for lack of a better word, are petrol-based or run on coal. We're probably talking about systems, energetic drive systems that power such craft, at least theoretically, that may be hundreds of thousands of years in advance of what we have. These machines themselves may be almost android, that they are highly intelligent machines. And if they require, that they may not require beings in them, although they may well, some of them transport other intelligences. Dr. Reich, who is probably, for my money, the most maligned, misunderstood, and derided scientist of the last few hundred years, was, among other things, a brilliant natural scientist, a highly respected psychiatrist who was not only trained in the early Freudian method, but was Freud's first assistant for 6 years, from about 1923 until 1929, when they broke. Reich's work, and it's a thread of scientific discovery that runs almost 40 years. What is common to it is how energy functions in the living and non-living realm. Everything from how the energetics of a amoeba splitting is functionally identical to how a weather front becomes a hurricane is functionally identical to the function of the orgasm, which is functionally identical to how a star system grows to be itself and ultimately deteriorates. I first became aware of Dr. Reich's work in my first year of university and read part of one of his books, realized I was in the presence of an extraordinary mind. The book is called, let's see, which one was it? Character Analysis. And it is about the psychology of the human being and how it is driven or repressed by suppressed energy, and how a neurotic organism can never fully realize its potential, and how society, government, other forces play on the truly natural nature of human beings and suppress them to control them. It's a sweeping story that Reich was at the center of from the 1920s until his death in 1957. Where Reich plays into the study of UFOs is when the phenomena broke in 1947. He had already emigrated to the United States, was practicing as a psychotherapist in New York City, and really paid no attention to it. A few years later, he moved to rural Maine, where he lived the rest of his life and built his home and laboratory. And one day in, I believe it was 1952, guests who were staying with him said that they had observed light phenomena in the sky that did not meet the criteria of anything that they understood. They weren't meteorites or, aircraft or whatever. Ultimately, Reich, like many people at the time, who was very concerned about the state of the atmosphere, and remembering at this time, not that you lived through it, but a tremendous concern about nuclear fallout. In the early 50s, there was an ever-present fear of nuclear war. And was there a way to clear the atmosphere? And at a time when southern Maine, where he lived, was suffering from a very kind of self-contained drought in the greater area of, say, 50 miles or so where he was, he developed a deceptively simple device, which was based on what I would call the drawing principle. When I was a kid and, I'd have a pimple or a boil or something, and I'd be staying with my Russian grandmother. She had a very simple folk remedy of cutting a potato in half, and she'd give you half and you'd hold it there. All I knew as a kid was that it cooled it. But then when I became a Boy Scout, I learned that if you pack mud on a bee sting, it will make it feel better. In fact, what is really happening there is the natural energy in that mud, in that potato, is drawing the toxin to the surface, is speeding up the crisis in that wound, is speeding up the healing time. It simply is factual. And what he found was working with a series of long metal pipes connected to, I don't know what you call it in the UK, but it's the industrial version of the flexible cable, which contains electrical wires that snakes through our homes. We call it BX cable here. And the industrial version is much thicker. And if you attach long lengths of industrial BX cable and grounded one end in running water or deep water or a pond and aimed the other end into the sky, it would literally draw energy from the atmosphere down to it. I can only say for anybody whose eyebrows are furrowing now or thinking, well, maybe he was making sense there, but he's off on a tangent now. You can study this information if you're interested in looking into it more deeply. Two of the best on the internet locations are the American College of Orgonomy, the term that he coined to name the science of how energy functions, ORGONOMY in Princeton, New Jersey, and the OBRL, Orgone Biophysical Research Laboratory in Ashland, Oregon, run by my friend and colleague, Dr. James DeMeo, who has done more cloud busting, the term that Reich applied to moving the atmosphere and breaking droughts. And Jim has been involved in breaking droughts all over the world over the decades. But it is technology that is not acknowledged. You'd think, my God, if it works, why aren't we using it with our international water crisis? Well, that would mean you'd have to acknowledge the other things of Reich's that are considered controversial around human sexuality and the like, and the fact that the United States government, under the otherwise, I think in many respects, great President Eisenhower, between 1952 or 55 and a few months before John Kennedy was elected president in 1960, burned more than 8 tons of Reich's original publications and literature because the Federal Drug Administration, at the time run by literally thugs, simply had decided that Reich was a sex quack. Why? Well, he was interested in sex. Why even replicate any of his experiments? Because we all know he was a quack. That they targeted him and ultimately caught him, one of his assistants, on a technicality of interstate shipment of one of his experimental devices. And Reich decided to represent himself in court. Big mistake. Did a year in prison. A week before, 10 days before he was scheduled to be released, was found dead in his cell. Some people think he was murdered. He may have been, but at the same time, I know from studying the literature and interviewing many people who knew Dr. Reich, including my therapist many years ago, Dr. Ellsworth F. Baker, who was Reich's first assistant for the last 11 years of his life, that Reich was a type A character. He was a chain smoker. He ate a lot of heavy type European food. He was, to put it mildly, stressed out in popular terminology, and it must have crushed him to be imprisoned, especially under the circumstances that he was. Truly a soul-destroying experience for him. Again, it's almost wrong to try to compress this all into a few minutes.
I'm going to have to demand you come back on the podcast at some point. This is what I'm going to do right now in front of all the listeners. Do you understand this? We're going to have to get you on to talk about it in the future if we're out of time here.
I'll do it if you send me the same giant fee that you're sending me for this one.
Well, let me just clarify here, and I guess people will go on Google.
Sure.
The reason that I think Reich is in my mind is because these glowing balls of light that we were discussing before, the character and flavour of the actual testimony that we're getting from Rendlesham Forest does not tally with my pop culture understanding of UFOs, which involves, like I say, very kind of practical, down-to-earth stuff. It all seems to go a little bit more Reichian, for want of a better term.
Well, number one, UFOs cover the entire panoply, the entire classification of unidentified flying objects, which may run from the extremely ethereal to the decidedly machine-like. And the fact is that the cloud busting that Reich did, which indeed did break that drought, and a year or so later in a true field test in one of the most moisture-starved parts of the United States, they did the research so that if they got the results, it would be definitive. Outside of Tucson, Arizona in 1956, it broke every weather record in the history of the state and caused flooding in places where it hadn't seen rain, more than 5 inches in 50 years. However, the fact that the device drew UFO activity is well documented and multiply witnessed, but of course it was used to belittle, help to demean Reich's scientific reputation and other important work. And ultimately, most people, when they hear the name, just think it's a footnote to being a crank. I have seen a cloudbuster in operation. I have seen it change the complexion of the entire sky in southern New Jersey, where this demonstration was arranged for myself and a number of colleagues years ago. It was one of the most shattering days of my life. I had read about it for years, but to see it was something else. Here's the deal, though. Larry Warren had alleged some months into our work, when he saw his first photo of a cloudbuster at my home, right before we went to our first trip to England, that they had one of these on base and that it was huge and painted, kind of olive military color, trailer mounted, and by the runway. And I called him on it. I mean, come on, don't, yank my chain. And he was insistent. And let me tell you, you read Left at Eastgate, I think I present credible evidence that not only was there one there at the time, for whatever reasons that it was developed and built by the Air Force, but that some years later, and many of your listeners will remember this, the so-called freak storm of October 1987 that swept through part of England and I believe ended up in southern Wales. We know that it took down more than 1.3 mature evergreen trees in the Rendlesham Forest in 3 hours without a drop of rain, and yet it's still classified as a hurricane, but hurricanes are moisture-driven. There is a problem here, whether or not it was being used to clear the area over the runway or more horrific as a weather weapon. Which, of course, has been the subject of much speculation over the decades. I have no idea. But this is the tip of the iceberg, and I'll be glad to come back to it in a future program, Nick.
Do you know what, man? You're absolutely right. I'll just tell the listeners. Here's where I was going to go. I was going to say to Peter, do you think these extraterrestrials are using orgone technology? You drop that bombshell. Hey, how about this? Your own government's using orgone technology. All right, we got a lot to get into there, Peter. It's been an absolute joy. I want to thank you for coming on The Cult of Nick. It's been wonderful to talk to you. How can people get in touch with you? How can they follow up your work? Tell us a little bit about that, and then I shall let you go.
Sure. Right now, I don't have a website up and running, but if they're on Facebook or want to friend me or want to join Facebook, I'm the Peter Robbins in Ithaca, New York. Follow me. I post shows when I'm going to be a guest on a show, research papers, conferences I'll be speaking at. as my time allows, I'm happy to speak with folks who contact me, which is not always the case. And for anybody that is interested, if you go to my page, you'll see my next 2 appearances coming up on July 2nd in historic Memphis, Tennessee, along with my friend Travis Walton, who I'm very proud to have just been an associate producer on an important feature-length documentary about his 1975 experience. You can find that information on my page, as well as the 4th of July weekend, when we will again be screening that documentary and be giving separate talks at the big UFO conference in Roswell, New Mexico. And lastly, I just want to give a shout out to a friend of ours, the amazing Pandora Spox, an extraordinary woman, a great artist, one of the coolest people I know. There in London. Hi, Pandora. We love you. And without her, we wouldn't have been connected up and doing this show right now.
Yeah, absolutely right. And hello to her. And what a wonderful interview. And Peter, I insist we get you back in the future. And thanks for spending some time with us here on The Cult of Nick. That was wonderful, man. That was really good. We'll...
Hey, that was a good... Boy, that flew.
This is The Cult of Nick.
So a little bit of podcast business then. Let's see. First of all, yes, last week's show, I explained to you the kind of dilemma that's going on. Someone sent me a little message on the Facebook page saying, yeah, we got a Facebook page, The Cult of Nick. I think it is Facebook.com/The Cult of Nick. Go on to the main website, thecultofnick.co.uk, and I'll try and link across to it if you're a Facebook person. I've really not made my peace with that website yet. Much prefer Twitter. But anyway, someone sent me a message on that, and it escapes me who it was, but they said, it sounds like you're at a bit of a crossroads. And in a sense, I kind of am, in terms of what on earth it is I'm supposed to be doing with this thing that I call my career. You know, podcast listeners know, all right? Members of the cult get what's happening here. I've been working in the media all my life. You know, I've got some points of view that I don't think are that controversial that put me in a very difficult position. For example, right, I don't think that the way the BBC is funded is fair, right? And the BBC is the lion's share of the media here in this country. So I'm confined to working in commercial media, and the commercial media side of, you know, the operation here in the UK, of what's going on, the media landscape, well, it's kind of having difficulties. Some of it because it's being attacked from all corners. On the one hand, it's gotten more rivals than we've ever had because all these people have suddenly got access to a global communication system, which is the internet, and plenty of people are starting to do quote-unquote broadcasting on the internet. What do you do about that? You know, you can't really challenge it. And also, as I've made clear in previous episodes of The Cult of Nick, in a straight battle between the broadcast media and someone on the internet, well, maybe we've got a bit of fun on our hands. But in the kind of battle that we have to have at the moment, the broadcasters have their hands tied behind their back. So, you know, commercial media is in a difficult position because what it's always done really well is break the rules and ignore the rules in a way that the BBC can't. And I've always enjoyed that. I've always really, really liked that. And I don't like having to sit round, you know, talking about compliance and stuff. The very small amount of work I've done for the BBC, I could have, oh dear, scripts everywhere and, you know, being told what to say and, oh dear, very controlled, in my opinion. So, you know, what do? Well, I'm eking out a living, and I'm eking out a living by working on an independent local radio station, probably one of the few in the country that is not owned by the massive conglomerate that I kind of fell out with a little bit when I used to work at a radio station in London, LBC. In no way connected to them, and in no way connected to the BBC either. So it's this, you know, it's a small station, but it's one of those stations that's doing really well. Why? Because traditional advertising works, and internet advertising is still very much unclear. There's a lot of cowboys kicking around in that industry, whereas if you've got a radio station and if you've got a business locally and you advertise on that local radio station, as long as you've got an actual local radio station, it's not been networked, you pull in business. So the place where I work, if people advertise on our radio station, I don't know, that maybe they own a shoe shop or whatever, then they get a return on that. So we've got a pretty good business model going. And in terms of what I say on the podcast, the people at the radio station aren't bothered. As long as I'm doing what I'm supposed to do on the radio, they're not bothered. Which I can't tell you how unique that is. I wonder if it's entirely unique. It might actually be unique. I think most broadcasters end up attaching, conditions to what you can say online to the people that they employ. And the radio station, The Bay in Lancaster, where I work, they've never done that. And I can't thank them enough for that, because I don't think I'm particularly controversial in anything that I say. Do you? Do you listen to this podcast and think, oh yeah, how shocking or how controversial? I don't think so. I mean, what is it? What is the most far out thing I've said? I mean, I don't think I interview people who come out with far out points of view. And this is the other thing that's really frustrating. I don't see any harm in that either. I think everyone can compartmentalise what they're being told. You have to. Compartmentalise is the wrong word. Context. Everyone can context what they're hearing. So if I say to you, right, here's a guest and here's what they think, I don't think you're that stupid that you're just going to take that all on board and go, yeah, proves it. That's how the world works, right? But broadcasters do think like that. They believe that, well, they don't actually. The law of the land believes that. The law of the land governing this country, all right? The establishment think you're that stupid that if they allow you to hear uncensored ideas, then, what could happen? So I find that tedious, and it's always really annoyed me, and that's what this podcast is about, being able to speak normally, like you might do if you met someone for a drink in a pub or whatever, And that's what I'm aspiring for here, but I've started doing this TV show that I told you about last week, and it's across Manchester. Now, most of the listeners to this podcast aren't even in this country, so it hasn't seemed worth banging on about it too much. But if you live in Manchester, I think you might enjoy it. It's a good show. It's very mainstream, though. We are not going into these kinds of areas that we do on the podcast because we want to get a big audience, and that's what it's about. So we're talking about very mainstream topics. Look, this podcast gets 2,500 listeners. You can't make money with that, really. The TV station needs a few more viewers than 2,500 people. That'd be a disaster. So that's why editorially, the two things that I'm doing and most passionate about, the three things that I do and I'm so passionate about in media are so different. This podcast is a million miles away from the TV show in Manchester, which is the capital of the north of England, really. It's one of the biggest, it's the second city of Britain. It's the second biggest. It's not the second biggest, but it's probably the second most influential place in the UK. There'll be people in Birmingham a bit annoyed about that, but it is really. It's where Oasis are from. It's where the Happy Mondays are from, the Stone Roses. It's the centre of everything in my head, to be honest. There we are. It is what it is. Deal with it. But the point is, right, what I'm saying to you is that I'm doing this TV show. If you live in Manchester in the north of England, and there is a good proportion of people that listen to this podcast like that, and there's about 30, 40 people, if you put on the TV, that's me doing it. Obviously, I'm not talking about UFOs. That's not going to happen because that station needs to make some money, so we're doing very kind of mainstream content. It's very similar to the kind of thing I was doing on LBC in London, and you can't pick it up any other way than on the television at the moment. It might be the case in the future you'll be able to watch it on the internet. They can't do that at the moment. It's a local TV station. It's not a big budget. It's not, don't go imagining it's going to be like ITV or anything like that. It's none of those things. It is what it is. It's a local TV station for people who live in Manchester. And I'm doing it now, and I'm on there, and I've not been banging on about it too much, although it's been in the back of my mind, because a part of me thought maybe it wasn't going to happen. Part of me, right up until the moment we were doing it, I kept expecting them to go, we can't do this now because, I don't know, a spanner has thrown itself into the works. We didn't think about it, and now, no, it's all gone wrong. So, it's one of them things, and my main income is still the radio stuff, because, like I say, the TV station's just started. I haven't got any advertisers or anything like that as far as I'm aware. If you live in Manchester, want to advertise on that station, ring them up. I'm sure their rates are very reasonable. And there we are. So that's a splurge that explains what's going on in my head in the real world. Let's have a little look to see what we've got in terms of comments from listeners to the podcast. Got a comment here from regular contributor Melissabian. Hello. Says, as regards Stuart and Janet Swerdlow. It's on that episode, so not last week's, but the week before. The grass is not green. I would like to ask the Swerdlows, who is the master who makes the grass green? I like that. You see, the thing is, if you'd never heard this podcast before, and I'm really worried about that, you know, this is not intended for most people to listen to, right? If I've started doing a TV show, in the event that that becomes successful and that lots of people come to this podcast expecting me to be talking about the kind of things that I do on the telly, this is not for you. This is a podcast that's kind of like about the totally alternative side of life, right? So I've got a fear going on. I got to be honest with you, dear cult members, that we might have a horde of people that will come along that won't comprehend what we're going on about here, because, you know, we're very much in the heart of a subculture here. We're very insular. We're all kind of aware of these concepts and oi. But anyway, it's all hooked around this thing called Discordianism, right? And Milicibian is referencing this thing called Discordianism. What's that, Nick? I'll tell you. It's a joke religion. What do you mean, a joke religion? Well, I mean, a religion that's not real, right? It's stupid, isn't it? You know, why would anyone think that there was a little magic god out there doing something, you know, special for you? Why would it be bothered, right? It's the idea that, you know, the whole thing might be nonsense. And so what we do is we pretend that there's a goddess, right, called Eris, taken from the ancient Greeks, actually, goddess of chaos. And we go, yeah, all right, well, we'll worship her because it looks like she's in charge. Because I tell you what, the world doesn't make much sense, really, does it? It doesn't look like it's been made by a single mind. It looks like it's, well, at best, made by committee. Right? Anyone who's ever seen the duck-billed platypus will be thinking, yeah, it's probably a committee kind of thing, that, isn't it? You know, there's loads. Life is not perfect. You talk to someone who's religious, they go to you, oh, look around you, the world's so perfect, everything works so brilliantly. No, it doesn't. All right, how about this? Talk to anyone who's given birth, right? Women who've given birth, and you tell me that it's perfect, right? As that kind of thing's happening. And don't, you know, that's not perfect. There are ways you could perfect that. I mean, what do you think a cesarean section is? That's a way of perfecting the birth process, all right? So get down off your high horse. We ain't living on a perfect world. We're living in a world that is being perfected, perhaps. We're improving it, but we ain't in a perfect world. And I'll tell you this, the idea that, you know, religion is a joke makes complete sense to me, and that's why I'm into this idea of a joke religion. The idea that God might be a woman makes complete sense to me. So there you go. My joke goddess is a goddess. And the idea that gods aren't that bothered about us and that they, you know, dismiss us and aren't interested, well, do you know what's one of the key qualities of Eris? She's not interested in people, really. She thinks you're a waste of time. How about that? She doesn't want you to worship her either. You can't join my religion. You're not allowed. You have to make your own. You can call it Discordianism if you want, but you don't believe the same thing as me. That's how it works anyway. And Milicibian is referencing this idea that you are the master that makes the grass green. Robert Anton Wilson, one of the people that popularised Discordianism to a certain extent. I mean, I say popularised, hardly anyone's heard of it, but he's one of the people that pushed it in a big way in the past, and he used to often say that you are the master that makes the grass green. And he's referencing a Zen koan there. And the idea runs like this. Who is the master that makes the grass green? Where's the great magician that turns all of the grass green? Was it God that did it? Yeah, when he made the earth, he made it all green, didn't he? Did he? If you were to look at grass through your eyes, it's your particular shade of green. We're all familiar with this one, right? This is a classic conversation. Oh, when I look at the colour blue, does it look the same as when you look at the colour blue? Well, no, not really, because it's being filtered through your eyes or my brain or your brain. We both have different perspectives on the world. We both have different associations attached to the colour blue. Even if it is the same colour, right, what we mean by the colour blue is defined by our experience of life on this planet. So who's the great magician that makes the grass green? You are. You're the one that makes it look green, really. You're the one who knows what green is, and your eyes are the thing that is turning that set of signals that we call green light into green inside your head. That's the idea. Who is the master that makes the grass green? The idea is that you're the one who's actually determining events around you. You're the one who's interpreting events around you. Everything you see is filtered through your perspective. Everything you hear is the opinion of the person relating those facts to you. That's how it works. That's the world in which you live. You don't know anything at all. You're just guessing. You're guessing. You formed an impression about how the world works, and it's your impression, and good luck with it. I hope it's a good one, I hope it works. I hope you can drive round, the world without bumping into too many objects with the current reality tunnel that you're using. Melisibian, I love your comment. Thank you. Just guessing. You don't know anything at all. You're just guessing. You don't know anything at all. Got a load of donations after last week's show. I think maybe I stooped to the point of begging, didn't I? I was banging on about the fact that I'm not rich. I think it's because I've started doing a TV show. I don't want any cult listeners going away thinking, oh, that's it now, he's sold out, he's made the big cash. No, sir, it's local telly. And I'm not a millionaire, it's just not happened. It might happen in the future if it's successful, but we just started, so it's not where it's at the moment, money-wise. And I think I ended up banging on about that. We should be okay. Thank you enormously for all of the donations we had across the last week. We had, let me see here, Marcus has popped some money in the tin. Thank you very much, sir. Who else we got? Emma, have I thanked you already? I'm not sure. Emma's whacked some money in there. Grant put some in as well. Glyn has popped some money in the tin. And, Grant put in another donation. Grant, you're out of control, mate. He's giving us loads of cash. He wants to keep us going. He's put a note along with this, actually. Hi, Nick. Hope you keep going with the podcast. It's second to none. In terms of a replacement for Russell Brand, he caught me out too. I recommend Alan Watt, cuttingthroughthematrix.com, and freemantv.com. Best regards, Grant, says Grant. Yeah, I'm familiar with those guys. I don't think I've ever kind of got into their work yet. I've certainly read some of it. Alan Watt, particularly, because he's got a name so similar to Alan Watts, plural, with an S on the end. Alan Watts with an S on the end. He's kind of a Zen Buddhist preacher from the 60s. I like him a lot, Alan Watts. And so that's always annoyed me that Alan Watt has a similar name with a missing S. Do you know what, ironically, I think that's probably the thing that's made me watch less of his stuff, but I'm familiar with him. He's good. Worthwhile checking out that website, I think. And then the Freeman TV as well. I'm familiar with him. I think he was on Edge Media TV, which was the last television I did. I did 2 series on a TV station that was like on Channel 200 on Sky, and it was all about this kind of stuff. The Cult of Nick on telly, that show, really. We hit all these topics hard. It was a lot of fun, and I think he was on that. I seem to remember seeing him on that a few times, and I'm aware of his work. But I shall try to use them as replacements. I just like Russell Brand because he had a sense of humour. I like things that are funny sometimes, and then he suddenly starts banging on about some of the topics we talk about, starts saying don't vote, which is something that makes a lot of sense to me because I don't think politicians are up to it. And yada yada, then he just kind of turns around and goes, you got to vote Labour, and you think, oh right, he's like a Ben Elton type person. Ruined. Anyway, thanks for your suggestions, Grant, and thanks for your donations as well. Loads of people putting money in the tin at the moment. Thank you very much. thecultofnick.co.uk helps keep the podcast on the air and helps keep it as a kind of priority for what I'm doing at the moment. I'll tell you what, we're at the end of the show now, I think. Very little else to say to you apart from, did this get out on time? I finished it on the Tuesday. Did I manage to upload it on the Tuesday? Does anyone care? I don't know. See you next Tuesday! You don't know anything at all. You're just guessing. You don't know anything at all. You don't know anything at all. You're just guessing. You don't know anything at all. You're just guessing. You don't know anything at all. You're just guessing.
This is the Cult of Nick.